Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's the host of Mully and Haugh, 670 The Score, and a contributor to NBC Sports Chicago. Please welcome David Haugh to the program. David, it's great to have you on. How are you?
Hey, John, doing well. Pretty busy week this week, but that's a good thing.
What was your reaction to this Ryan Poles news for the Bears?
I think the reaction is that I thought it might go on a little bit longer. Actually, I felt like they wanted to get this done and they wanted to hire him before he got out of town. Maybe he was on his way to Minnesota. That contributed to it. But yeah, I think that from the beginning of this process, the big thing, big picture wise, was the Bears really needed to commit to change, organizational change this offseason. I just felt like after 7 years under Ryan Pace and 4 of Matt Nagy, they had not won a playoff game. And so that was the focus. And I think it'd be silly to try to predict or conclude whether or not this was a great hire or a terrible hire. I stay away from the extremes on day one of a general manager's tenure. I think the focus would be on he's got a good reputation. He's going to have to deliver results. But the fact is, Ryan Poles represents a change from Ryan Pace, and that to me is progress.
Was he your preference amongst all the candidates the Bears interviewed?
Well, I don't know that I'd say that he was my preference, John. I think that it's really hard to know what some of these guys who have never run departments before or been in charge of teams, it's really hard to know what to value and how good they're going to be at it, because I just don't know that it's one of those things that you realize how good they're going to be until they do it. So my preference likely would have been going into this to do what the Bears really don't always do, or really seldom do. They never have done this at the GM spot. Hire experience. I might have gone for somebody or talked to people who had done the job before. Rick Smith with Houston, Rick Spielman in Minnesota. These kind of guys. Jeff Ireland, I would have given a long, hard look at just because of his experience. The thing is that the Bears typically stay away from that for reasons that we could talk about, but I think that they're well established. I mean, they like they don't like people around that might challenge the conventional wisdom or the way that they typically approach things, and that's why you see, from going back to Jerry Angelo, who had never done the job before, replaced by Phil Emery, who had never done the job before, replaced by Ryan Pace. Same story, and now Ryan Poles is the latest first-time general manager to take over the Chicago Bears.
Does that scare you a bit, that they keep going with that same mold?
Well, I think, I don't know about scare, but I do think it should concern some people that it prevents you from making positive assumptions, right? Let's put it that way. And the cynicism surrounding the Bears is easy to understand when you see them consistently do business in the way that they're used to doing business, and it's not working, and they're not necessarily changing. And that's the problem. It's easy to sit here and say, whoever they hire is the wrong choice, and everybody's got an opinion just because it's an industry in which we second guess everything. But when you go into it and you try to urge them to value experience, then I think when they don't, it makes you wonder why. And look, it has nothing to do really with Ryan Poles and his credentials as much as it just has to do with an organizational philosophy. For some reason or another, the Mccaskies don't feel comfortable hiring people who might come in and tell them how to do things. They're much more comfortable, it seems, based on these practices, of hiring somebody who comes in and they're telling them, this is where the coffee machine is, this is where you park your car, this is where your office is, this is the way we do things here, even if they don't work.
What do you think of Bill Polian helping out this search?
Well, I've always been somebody that respects Bill Polian. I haven't gotten too carried away in the criticism of having his involvement. I really value his judgment and have a lot of respect for his accomplishments. It doesn't bother me that he is going to leave after his consultant's role, and the fact that people want to say he doesn't have accountability. That's the nature of any consultant in any field. You're buying their expertise, and from from what we've been led to believe, he has been definitely instrumental in structuring this search and making it as widespread and comprehensive as it's been. And frankly, with the Bears, you want somebody in the room that has some football acumen. And so they've widened scope, and they've been pretty comprehensive. And they, out of 15, 16 candidates for the general manager job, they arrive at Ryan Poles, and I feel like with Bill Polian, they left no stone unturned. So I really like the way that they went in that direction. And without Bill Polian, I'm not convinced that they would have fired Ryan Pace. So I suppose that from that standpoint alone, it was a good investment with the money they spent to get Bill's expertise.
How would you characterize this situation for Ryan Poles, everything that he's stepping into with the Bears right now?
Well, okay, so then to take a step back, John, and you look at it from the vantage point of a 36-year-old first-time executive, you've got to be excited. And I think that you've got to look at this as an opportunity that's a rare one, because you have never run a team before, and you're stepping into a football-crazy market. You're stepping into an organization that is on the verge of a breakthrough and changing locations and building its own stadium. So that comes with just a ton of energy and excitement and enthusiasm that is at your disposal if you make the right decisions. And you also have a franchise quarterback, by the way, potentially, who is on his rookie deal, which would allow you to build around him. If you want to objectively, you separate the cynicism that we're sort of inherently conditioned to have about the Chicago Bears, this is a goldmine situation. This is an enviable spot for Ryan Poles to be in, because he is also, by the way, in a division that could be the worst in football, or maybe put it the other way, the most winnable in football if Aaron Rodgers doesn't return to Green Bay. So you have a tremendous opportunity to make an immediate impact in a football city that is desperate for success.
Do you think he makes some significant moves coming up this offseason? Like, what do you think his plan should be moving forward?
Well, we'd be guessing, right? Because we don't really know what he stands for, other than he comes from an organization that was smart enough to take Patrick Mahomes. And good for them. The Chiefs are the Chiefs because they drafted Patrick Mahomes, and they got all the other playmakers, and Andy Reid is there and smart enough to figure out how to use them all. But Ryan Poles, if you're going to look at the Bears objectively, they have to. I want to know what he's going to emphasize. What do you want to stand for? What's your identity going to be as a football organization, as a football team? Are you going to invest in the offensive line? I think that would be my priority one. You've got some aging stars on defense. You've got some bloated contracts, perhaps. You can look at Eddie Jackson's. The Robert Quinn and Khalil Mack are expensive. You're going to have to lock up Roquan Smith long term. But those are things that when you look at defensive talent, they have it. They've got it. So I don't know that you feel like you need to do much more than tweak your defense. Offensively, you've got an immense challenge. So you don't have the playmakers that you're used to being around if you're Ryan Poles, and you certainly don't have anything on offense that you know that you do well. You have a quarterback full of potential who had an uneven rookie season. You've got a dynamic running back, and then you've got the rest. And I don't know that you know what you have, but you've got to figure out how to what to prioritize, which I hope is the offensive line, and then how to identify pieces, whether it's through the draft, which they don't have a first rounder, or free agency, or maybe a specific targeted, well-executed trade to get the right people in your building, on your roster, to make an impact on Sunday.
David Haugh here on Sports Talk Chicago. David, what's your take on the head coaching search right now?
Well, as we sit here today, they're in the midst of interviewing Dan Quinn and Matt Eberflus after interviewing, first of all, Jim Caldwell. Those seem to be the three finalists. I think for the sake of thoroughness, and I don't know that they need to be in a huge hurry, you would like to see Ryan Poles extend the search to add a name or two, a person or two who is his own, who is he would say, okay, if I ever got the job as a general manager, this is who I was going to interview. Whether that's Eric Bieniemy or somebody else on his list from his past, or just recommended to him. Maybe it's somebody who was on the Bears list they've already talked to. Doug Peterson is a guy that he worked with in Kansas City. Brian Flores is somebody that they share, a Boston College connection. Whatever it is, whoever it might be, I would like to see him extend the search just to bring in somebody who he wants to talk to, if for no other reason, John, to remove that layer of doubt that this is somebody else's search and it would be somebody else's candidate. Because we went through that in Chicago with Ryan Pace and John Fox. Ryan Pace almost was absolved accountability and responsibility for the John Fox hire because everybody seemed to attach John Fox to Ernie Accorsi, the consultant who was in the Bill Polian role back in 2015, which I never thought was really right, because Ryan Pace, if you are the general manager and you get the job, you should have the gumption to tell them from day one, I am or I'm not going to hire this guy. So that's why I'd like to see Ryan Poles maybe add some people who are his guys and interview those and then make the choice from that pool.
Who do you prefer as head coach out of these candidates?
Well, the ones left, if I had to say, if I were interviewing these guys, my sense is that Dan Quinn would probably blow me away. He understands how to communicate. He's a very dynamic talker. He speaks football language. You have no doubt where you stand after a conversation with Dan Quinn. But that's just me. I don't know how that would connect with Ryan Poles or what they're looking for necessarily. I have a lot of respect for Jim Caldwell. I just don't know if, frankly, you got a 67-year-old head coach who's known for stability, and you've got a young quarterback that you want to, build with for the next 5 to 7 years, you would imagine conservatively. Is that really, are those two things compatible? Maybe you could make that argument, maybe not. I guess it wouldn't be my first choice, but you could live with Jim Caldwell. Matt Eberflus is also very intriguing, only from the standpoint of if you talk to people around the National Football League, whether it's people that have worked with him in Indianapolis or in Dallas, he has a ton of respect, and he's somebody that you could see being the quote-unquote leader of men, the kind of guy they're looking for, even though he's a quote-unquote defensive head coach. I think you could find a way to sell the idea of Matt Eberflus coming to the Bears and growing together with Ryan Poles. In terms of compatibility, you could see those two guys growing together, sharing more than just an agent, sharing a vision and a common purpose. But I do think that also gets you back to two guys who have never done the job before, maybe ideal for the Mccaskies, but not necessarily the ideal situation for a franchise that really needs an injection of confidence and energy.
What's the most important quality or characteristic that you want in a head coach?
That's a really good question. I think that you want to be able to have a clear vision of what your football team looks like every Sunday. You want to have a clear definition of who you are and how to get there. You want to have a clear identity. You want to have somebody that when they say the Chicago Bears are coming to town, you know what that looks like. You know what that sounds like. And if you're the opponent, you know what that feels like. I think you're in Chicago. You have to embrace the physicality of what that represents in terms of tradition, in terms of the elements. It's old-fashioned, and a lot of people want to play, hey, you look at the Final Four, and it's video game football, and it's offensively driven, and you've got these schematic geniuses as head coaches, and they're right, and they're absolutely right. But you look at the Bears roster, and that's not who they are, and they're a long way from getting there. So I think that you want to embrace certain things about the realities of your organization and your past, and certainly your roster as well. So I want a head football coach that can find a way to make my team as good as it possibly can be, max out my potential, and play with a signature each and every Sunday.
And do you see that in the three finalists that we just talked about?
I believe Dan Quinn could establish that identity, that mentality, and eat it to play hard, play tough, and play a certain style of football. We're talking about a guy that was the defensive coordinator of one of the most legendary defenses in Seattle that we have seen in the NFL since the '85 Bears. There's a connection there. I mean, he understands what it's like to call signals for a defense that's historically good. So there's no question. And defense still matters. I know it's still one of those things where, how are you gonna keep pace with Rams and the Bucks and the Chiefs. How are you going to be that kind of team? Well, I don't know that you are. You're going to be able to compete maybe, but offensively, you have to find the right offensive coordinator, and that would be an important hire certainly. But Dan Quinn to me would have the clearest, most significant identity. I think the easiest one to identify, put it that way. Then the other two with Eberflus and Jim Caldwell, I'm really not sure. I think Jim Caldwell with the Colts and the Lions threw the ball an awful lot, and he was known for being pretty steady in the boat, and that's not a criticism. That's the way Lovie Smith sort of ran it, but Lovie had the defense. It was always his signature. So I think Dan Quinn of the candidates that are finalists probably has the most predictable identity.
Does his tenure in Atlanta concern you at all?
Well, John, I think he got fired, so he started 0-5, and he kind of the last 2.5 seasons were nothing that he necessarily proud of. Talking to some people down there, he left him with some situations with the salary cap that weren't really great. But I think guys on their second tour, the second go around, are going to learn from those kind of mistakes. He did win the NFC. He had an NFC championship. He coached in a Super Bowl. And that was as far as Lovie Smith got in Chicago. So I think that you have to respect the fact that he did what he did down there, and then things kind of fell apart. But he'll be better the second go around, whether it's in Chicago or New York or Minnesota, Denver, wherever he's interviewed. So they're going to have concerns about every candidate you hire. There's not the perfect candidate. You hire Brian Flores, you're going to have concerns about the reasons he was fired in Miami. You hire any of these guys and you're going to wonder, but I don't think that they rise to the level where I would say no, because of the way things ended in Atlanta. Dan Quinn can't succeed in Chicago. No, I don't agree with that.
What's the expectation for the Bears next year, assuming they hire the right guy, now they have Poles as general manager?
Get the most out of Justin Fields, show some competitiveness. You have, depending what goes on in Green Bay, a chance to maybe compete for a division title in the worst division in football, but that's okay. But I think you've got to have somebody that gets the most out of Justin Fields offensively. You've got to have a clear identity, and then you have to be competitive, and you have to finish the season with the arrow pointing up. You've got your first year, and you want to show progress. You can't be running in place, and you can't be, God forbid, taking a step backward by the end of next season. You want to be where you wanted to be at the end of this one, with a lot of optimism and hope invested in a young, promising quarterback.
How much time do you think they'll get, Poles and whomever the coach is? Will it be as long as Nagy and Pace, or less, or more?
I don't know that you can predict that yet, but I think that the Bears are pretty patient historically. Now, unless you absolutely are a dysfunctional mess that has lost grip of any sort of direction that you hope for, which is what happened with Phil Emery and Mark Trestman. But I don't envision that happening again. Let's hope not, because that was really a mess for everybody. So I think that they'll probably sign long-term contracts, get reasonably between 3 to 5 years, I would think, to show some progress. You want to win a playoff game. You don't want it to be a decade between playoff victories. Again, you want to start to see some direction here. And Brian Pace was here 7 years, and they got to the playoffs twice. Once they backed in, and once they earned and lost, but they didn't have a victory. You want to have somebody come in here and within 3 years have a playoff victory.
David Haugh still here on Sports Talk Chicago. David, a few more questions before we finish up. First off, your reaction to the Hall of Fame results was what?
Well, David Ortiz, somebody I voted for, and so I really, from a fan standpoint and a voter standpoint, you wanted to have somebody else besides him get in. I voted for five people, and I think that I understand what's going on with Bonds and Clemens and why they're not in. I did not vote for them. I think there's a distinction to be drawn between David Ortiz and the fact that he passed drug tests after the stringent policies were instituted in 2004, not in the Mitchell report, and there's some questions surrounding the positive test he did have after when he was mentioned in that back in the New York Times story. And Rob Manfred, the commissioner, basically exonerated him, and I put some stock in that. Now, it's one of these legal arguments almost you have to parse and you have to cite precedent and you have to explain. Whereas I wish the Hall of Fame would have, a little clearer direction for the voters, because everybody's going to interpret it differently. Like, I could sit here and explain to you the next half hour, each person I voted for and didn't vote for, and it could bore you to death, but everybody's got their criteria and it's different. And so I think that we could use a little guidance here.
Are you comfortable being the gatekeeper? Do you enjoy doing that?
I enjoyed it at first, and I think it's becoming, I do enjoy it. I have to say, I enjoy going through it. I enjoy the process, but what gets a little tiresome, to be honest, is having to constantly defend it. And I think I'm all for transparency and accountability, but it becomes harder to defend because you see these different arguments and you see the different rationale used and you understand it all, and then you start to second guess yourself a little bit, and then you're like, okay, this is why I did this, and it's just a process that it invites scrutiny, and it deserves criticism in some cases. And I think that we're privileged to have these votes, but at this point in time, it's like something that you look forward to every year, and then there's an element of you that kind of dreads it because of having to, explain and defend things that should be fun. And when we talk about baseball's struggle in appealing to the masses, this is part of that. This is part of that because there is such a division on these issues, the PEDs and not PEDs, and the Hall of Fame, and where the line for integrity and character is, and should that even be included? Because, you look around the league and who knows what about whom, so it becomes more of a morality discussion, which is really not something that you like your sports discussions to veer into. And yet that seems to be always the direction we end up heading.
Do you think the Veterans Committee puts in all these steroid guys?
I think at some point in time, whether it's a Veterans Committee, whether it's the creation of a new committee, whether it's just an edict from the people that run the Cooperstown Baseball Museum, somebody is going to come up with a way that is appropriate, that appropriately recognizes what these guys did. It's impossible to write the history of baseball without Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Alex Rodriguez, and everyone else who is going to be left out. Sammy Sosa here in Chicago. And I think those are the kinds of things you recognize and realize somebody's going to have to intervene and let everybody in, because when I don't know if you celebrate, it's a museum that celebrates baseball, certainly, but also commemorates everything that's happened. And how can you do that without acknowledging what these players accomplished at a time where they were celebrated and revered in some cases, and now they're going to be ostracized? So there's some inconsistencies there that I think reflect the problems baseball has in marketing its game. And that's going to be something I think eventually is a problem somebody figures out a way to solve.
And David, before we finish up today, last question: how did you get away with roasting George Mccaskey?
You're referring to the press conference where George said that when I was muted, and thank goodness I figured that one out, right, John? That it was the best question I've ever asked. I think it was funny, and George, I have a lot of respect for George. We have a pretty good relationship over the years, and let's face it, John, I did not unmute my Zoom my computer, and it was my fault. So if George roasted me and I got him a little bit back with a zinger, I deserved it. He probably did too. So it was all in fun.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure. Best wishes, of course, on Mully and Haugh. Great radio program on 670 The Score, and looking forward to the next time we chat. Thank you so much.
Keep up the good work, John. Thank you very much.